Welcome. Hi, my name is Karl, and I'm a small church pastor. Yeah. I always introduce myself that way for a couple of reasons. One, because it kind of adjusts expectations. Plus, it also tells everybody this is different than what we normally do. Usually we try to find the pastor of the largest group in the room and put them on stage, and that is not the case with me. Plus, we will be talking about that particular topic in this session, pastoring the small church without settling for less. So the first good piece of good news is, yes, you can pastor a small church well without settling for less. Here are the three main points we're going to be looking at today, and you'll see each of them on the screen as they come up. First step you have to do is you have to realize that you can be effective while you're small. Second, we have to discover how small churches function differently than our big church friends, because there are distinct differences that we are often not taught when all we're listening to are big church voices. They are correct within their venue, but they are different from how we work in our venue. And then the third point we're going to be looking at in this session is how to understand and use the unique DNA of your small church for God's glory. This is also a little section I like to call the "Why is my church so weird" section. And it's about, there's a reason why. The smaller your church is, the weirder it is. And instead of running away from the weird, there's usually value in the weird if we can understand that and adapt to it. So that's what we'll be looking at in this session. For everything I'll be doing in this session, plus I'll be doing the plenary session at 4:30, both of those are going to be here. So if you scan that QR code, or if you just simply go to karlvaters.com/Vinia2022, all of the notes for this session and all of the notes for my 4:30 session will be there. So that's the easiest way to find this. The nice thing about having online notes also is about a third to half of those notes will have a clickable link on them, and that link will usually go to an article that I wrote where you can get a little more information about that particular subtopic. Or if I reference another article or a book or whatever, I can link to it there as well. So any information you need for everything I'm doing today will be there. So first thing we want to take a look at is we want to ask and answer the question, what is a small church? Because when we talk about pastoring a small church without settling for less, small is a relative term. What one person means by small is different from what another person means by small. So I'm going to walk you through it. In my first book, The Grasshopper Myth, about 10 years ago, I defined small in one way. In my second book, Small Church Essentials, about 5 years ago, I defined small a different and better way. And now, 5 years later, I'm defining small in yet a third and even better way. And 5 years from now, I'll have something better than this. But for right now, here's my best working definition of what I mean when I say small church. There are two very distinct types of small churches. There's the church of 50, give or take 50. And there's the church of 150, give or take 50. Those are two very distinct types of small churches. If you're in a church of 50, give or take, and you just heard me say a church of 150, give or take, which means a church of 200 counts as small, you may be looking right now and going, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. If he thinks 200 is small, I do get it. Hang in there. The reason why a church of 50, give or take, plus a church of 150, give or take, are all considered small, even though there are distinct differences between those two types of churches, is this. As much as a church of 50, give or take, and 150, give or take, are different from each other, they have far more in common than they have differences. But once you get above the 200 mark or so, there you have more differences than similarities. Not in doctrine, not in the sincerity of the worship, not in the things that matter, but in the in the way we lead, things change dramatically. And the simple reason they change dramatically at about 200 or so is this. God knows everyone and can be everywhere, and you're not him. We have limits. There are only so many people you can be available for, only so many people whose names you can know, right? And once you get above that, that is our threshold for all of us. Some hit that threshold at 150, some can maybe stretch it to 250, but beyond that, it's very different. Now, at a church of 50 or so, you can know everybody and be there for everybody. At a church of 150 or so, you can pretty much know everybody and be there most of the time, but above 200 or so, you've got to entrust most of the hands-on pastoral care to others. It's simply a limitation of our physical bodies and of our mental capacity. That's as far as we can go. So that's what I talk about when I'm talking about a small church. So from that, let's get to our first point. What's the first way? Oh, here they are again. 3 ways that a small church can be an effective church. You can go ahead and take a picture of that, and then you'll have all 3 of them. But let's take a look at the first one right off the top. The first thing we have to do is we have to understand and realize that your small church can be an effective church. I have been a small church pastor for almost 40 years, well over 30. I didn't know I was a small church pastor until about a dozen years ago. You see, I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't arrived yet. Any minute now, any minute now. And after 20 or so years not arriving, you got to wonder, am I waiting at the right station? Is this the right train? Something is different here. And I had to go through a very, very challenging and difficult process to realize that maybe I'm actually not a big church pastor in waiting. Maybe a small church pastor is what I'm called by God to be, what I'm gifted by God to do, and what actually brings me the most effectiveness in my ministry. And that, in fact, has turned out to be the case. It happened in some difficult ways for me. We took a church. I live in Orange County, so not far from here. And when we first got there 29 years ago, tiny little church, much smaller room than this. On an average Sunday, there were about a dozen people. On a big Sunday, we might have had 30 people. They'd been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. So they were really hurting and almost ready to close the church. But I thought, we're in Orange County. You know, this is a place where big things happen. You know, we're near the original Calvary Chapel, the original Vineyards, Saddleback Church, Church on the Way, Mariners, Fuller Church Growth Institute, all of the big places that we know around there, Angelus Temple, all of these places are so close to us. Do you realize this area where we are right now, Orange and LA County specifically, is not just a place where big things happen, but it's a place where big movements have begun. I mean, for those who are coming from a Pentecostal charismatic background, Azusa Street is between here and my house, right? So I thought, hey, we're here, we're going to have big things happen, and year after year after year, it simply didn't occur. And every year I would go to my denominational meeting, and every year as I'd go to our denominational meeting for Southern Cal, the head of our denomination would give the report, and a part of the report that they about our churches in Southern California always involved a phrase like this. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, and over 80% are under 100. And then every time he gave that stat, the very next sentence was always some version of, we need to fix this problem. It wasn't explained why it was a problem. It was just simply assumed by him and everybody in the room, including me, that, wow, this is a problem we got to fix. We got a lot of small churches. We have to fix this problem. And then, so for a whole bunch of years, as I was hearing him say that, my response was, oh no. I'm sitting in the room with my fellow pastors. 80 to 90% of us apparently are blowing it. Because this person who's leading us and whom we trust and is a good guy says we got to fix this problem, and apparently those under 200 and those under 100 especially are a part of the problem. And every year I'd go, oh no, I'm a part of the problem. I don't want to be a part of the problem. I have to fix this. I have to get bigger so that I'm a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. It got so bad that at a certain point I actually found myself in counseling over it. So yeah, confession number 1 is, hi, I'm Karl and I'm a small church pastor. Confession number 2 is, hi, I'm Karl and I've been to therapy, and pastoral ministry put me there. And here I was, about 15 years ago, sitting in a counselor's office, sitting there wondering what's going wrong with me. And as I started laying my heart out for this counselor, he paused at one point. I asked him, I said, what am I supposed to do about this? And he said, Karl, it sounds to me like you need to figure out how to redefine success in ministry. And I didn't know if I wanted to walk out or punch him in the nose and then walk out. I said, wait a minute, redefine success in ministry. So you're telling me I've been trying to jump a 10-foot bar, but I can only jump 8 feet, so I should lower the bar to 8 feet and jump over that and call it success? That's not success, that's cheating. He said, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not talking about lowering any bar. What I'm telling you is this. If numbers are over here, success is over here. And then he said a sentence that changed my life. He said, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I looked at him and said, I don't even know what that means. And honestly, he answered me and said, yeah, I don't either. But that's what we have to figure out together, because chasing the numbers sounds like it's killing you. And it also sounds like it's killing a pretty good church. In fact, at that point, he asked me, if you took the numbers out of it, would you say your church is healthy or not? And before he barely had the question out of his mouth, my answer was, oh yeah, it's a really healthy church. Like, it took him back. He said, wow, you answered that very fast and very definitively. I said, yeah. I said, that's actually part of the problem. He said, what's the part of the problem? I said, the church is really healthy. He said, that's the problem. I said, yeah, because I keep hearing all healthy things grow. And I look at my church and it seems really healthy to me, but we're not getting bigger, so I must be doing something wrong, and I must be missing what I'm doing wrong. And then we started looking at it and asking ourselves, is it possible for a church to be healthy and effective and have an impact on our community and not necessarily continue to relentlessly grow numerically? And that's what we discovered is the case. And that's what we'll be walking through in some of this. So my first reaction was, oh no. I actually walked away from, in that season, when I was so frustrated and so discouraged at lack of growth, I actually went to my board and I told them, I'm taking a 40-day sabbatical. The only reason I took 40 days was because I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. I actually did a Bible search on my computer for somebody in here has to have taken an 80 or 100-day retreat. It's all 40s, just so you know. I figured if it's in the Bible, they'll give it to me. So I took 40 days away and really did not know if I would come back at the end of the 40 days. I was just so discouraged, so frustrated, and quite frankly, angry. I was angry at myself. I was angry at the church. I was angry at God. Got angry at Rick Warren for some reason. No idea why. And I went to the counselor, and we started talking and thinking about we have to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I came back to the church after the 40 days, and I wasn't better yet, but I was facing up instead of facing down. When I talk to folks coming out of drug and alcohol rehab through ministries like Teen Challenge, I always tell them this. I said, your life has been going like this. It's been going on a downward spiral. And they said, you might get a picture in your head that when you come to Jesus, all of a sudden your life is going to go from here to here, and that's not what happens. Your life circumstances have been going down for a while, and when you come to Jesus, your life circumstances are going to go from here to here. If you have a court date next week, you still have a court date next week after you give your life to Jesus. If you got divorced last year because your wife couldn't handle your addiction anymore, you give your life to Jesus, you'll still be divorced. Like, all those circumstances are going to be the same, but now you'll be facing in a different direction, and direction is everything. So that's what happened to me. I was still in the same circumstance, but I was facing in a different direction. So shortly after that 40 days, I went again to our annual conference for our denomination, and our superintendent got up and gave the same report again, as he's supposed to do. And a part of that report again was the same stats. Over 90% of our churches are under 200, 80% under 100. And I knew, of course, that the next sentence he was going to say was some version of, we need to fix this problem. So have you ever been in a room, maybe like this, where somebody's speaking and they trigger an idea in your head and you go off over here while the speaker's going off over there, and the speaker might as well be the teacher from Charlie Brown, right? You're not hearing anything that the speaker has to say because you've got a whole thing. It may be happening to some of you right now, right? That happened to me. He said that, and instead of that, you're going, oh no, something in me snapped that year. And instead of hearing his next sentence about how to fix this, that year, instead of thinking, oh no, I thought, oh, okay, so what? So what? Okay, so what? My church is small, so what? There's a lot of small churches, so what? I don't care anymore. And here's the deal. Whenever anybody says, I don't care anymore, what that actually means is they care so much they can't admit it to themselves anymore. That's what that always means. And that's where I was. I don't care anymore, so what? But here's the deal. I'm stubborn, so when I ask so what, I want to find out so what. So I did the research. I thought, let's find out what that actually means. Everybody's assuming all these small churches is a sign of a problem. Let's find out. And here's what I discovered. That stat right there tells you nothing, zero, nada, about the health and effectiveness of the church, of churches that they're dealing with. And here's why. I want you to imagine that this group of churches is in renewal and revival. And if you've got a group of churches, whether it's a denomination or a network, however that group is defined, you've got a group of churches working together, and if they are in renewal and revival, part of that renewal and revival will involve the planting of new churches, right? And when new churches are planted, they tend to be what size? Small, right? So because they're in renewal and revival, they're actually creating more small churches. So the percentage of small churches remains high because of the renewal and revival. Meantime, if that group of churches is in decline, then the existing churches will be smaller and smaller, and the percentage of small will remain high. Whether the group of churches is in renewal and revival or in decline, the percentage of small always remains high. And if you take a look around the world throughout history and today, you will see that to be the case. If you go today in places in South America and Africa and in Asia especially, where the church is really exploding numerically, where people are coming to Christ and where the pace of Christians is outpacing the growth of the population, which is the only actual church growth there is. The only real church growth is when Christians are increasing as a percentage of the overall population. Otherwise, what we call church growth around here is just consolidation into larger groups most of the time. Okay? But if you go to the places where the church is actually growing as a percentage of the population, it is almost exclusively being done by the multiplication of smaller venues, not by the building of larger ones. That is almost exclusively the case for 2,000 years and counting. So I looked at that and went, okay, that's the answer. So my third response then is, okay, now what? Okay, we've got a lot of small churches. Now what? What are we going to do about this? Maybe all of these small churches is not a problem for us to fix. Maybe all of these small churches are part of a strategy that God wants to use. Jesus said, I will build my church. Jesus knows what he's doing. And if for 2,000 years and counting, the Church of Jesus Christ, which is, by the way, the most relentlessly growing organism in history, still today, fastest growing religion on the face of the earth, both percentage-wise and by raw numbers, is Christianity. Not Islam, not anything else you've heard. Christianity. Where we are, not so much. But you know what? There are Christians outside the U.S. Just thought you'd like to know. And in a lot of those places, it's growing exponentially. When we see that, it happens almost exclusively of small venues multiplying themselves quickly in all kinds of different ways. So we look around and I started then asking myself, okay, now what? What do we do with all of this? Maybe this is part of how Jesus is building his church. Maybe we should go along with God's strategy instead of pushing against it, that we've got to have ever larger and larger venues. There's nothing wrong with big churches. I love my big church brothers and sisters. I want resources and encouragement for all of us so we can work together. So as I'm pondering this now, what? I was still not in a great place, but I was getting a little bit better. And one day I was scrolling through TV back when we used to change channels, and I ran across Apollo 13. It was in the middle of the movie, and I thought, oh, let's watch this. And I was just coming to this scene where, and for those of you who may not have seen the movie, Apollo 13, the movie is, of course, about Apollo 13, the actual event. It was supposed to have been the third moon landing, and partway through the moon there was damage to their craft, and what was going to be an exploratory mission of the moon becomes a rescue mission. They try to get the 3 astronauts back to Earth alive, and one thing after another keeps going wrong. And at one point in the movie, they rush into mission control, they rush up to the head of mission control, and they say, we got a problem with the air filters, we're about to run out of air filters. And he looks at them and goes, how did we not bring up enough air filters? He goes, oh, we brought up enough, but some of them are in the landing module, which we didn't use, so they've used up the ones in the main cabin, which is because they've stayed there too long. He says, well, the landing module is still attached. Have them float on over, grab them, and bring them back. He says, we've done that. They're a different size and shape. They won't fit into the hole. To which, in the movie anyway, he goes, oh, tell me this isn't a government program. Very next scene. A couple engineers take a couple big boxes of material and they dump it on a large table in front of all the other engineers. And essentially what they tell the other engineers is this. Everything that's on this table is everything that's on Apollo 13. So, using only what's on this table, we have to figure out how to make this fit into this, or they die. And by the way, the clock is ticking. Oh, and by the way, there's not a single thing on this table that's designed to do this job. But if we don't figure it out, they die. Go. And they look at the table like, I watched that and I thought, wow, I do not know a better metaphor of what it's like to pastor a small church than that. Really, Lord, this is the mess you gave me? Yep. And lives are at stake and the mission hasn't changed. Get the job done. That's our task. But there's nothing here that this isn't what they taught me. I can't work with. And I think Jesus responds, did you see the 12 I picked? They changed the world. You can change your community with your group you've got right now. There's a common saying in business and in church leadership circles in the last few years. They use the term, get the right people on the bus. Have you ever heard anybody say that recently? It's a good term. It actually makes sense. It's out of a really good book called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And the premise behind it is when you're hiring your staff and you're bringing the people in and you're putting your leadership team together, maybe the most important decision you'll make is who is going to be on that team. You've got to get the right people on the bus. And they're right. But if you're a small church pastor and you hear the phrase, get the right people on the bus, it's like, these are my people. This is my bus. You're acting like I have choices here. There's no right people, wrong people. I've got an Apollo 13 table mess. What you call the wrong people, I lovingly call my church members. This is what I have, all right? So this is my weird church starts coming in, okay? So what we need to start doing is we need to start rethinking. And one of the ways that we need to start rethinking is the church needs to embrace what's called the long tail. The long tail is a business principle that is behind everything that companies like Amazon and YouTube do. So let's take YouTube as an example. In YouTube, everybody wants a viral video. Okay, so on the left, going up, you've got the popularity of a video. So on the left, you've got a couple videos that have billions of views, okay? Across the bottom, you've got the number of products that there are, okay? So on the left, there are only one or two products that are in the multi-billion view. And then there are a few more that are in the multi-million views. And then there are a few more that have several 100,000 views. And then you get down to what they call the long tail, and you have millions and millions and millions and millions of videos that have just a handful of views. But here's the deal. In YouTube, there are as many eyes watching the small handful of viral videos as there are eyes watching the millions and millions and millions of small videos. Everybody wants to be the next, Justin Bieber video of a couple billion views, and we live stream our services, and maybe 5 people who were sick that day watch it. But there are millions of churches doing that and millions of eyeballs watching those videos. And the reason YouTube makes it available to everyone is because they recognize that the long tail feeds the big spike and the big spike feeds the long tail. They need both. Now, in the body of Christ, it's exactly the same way. You got a handful of massively big churches, and they get all the attention, but there aren't that many of them in the big spike. There's only a few of them. So there's a few churches in the hundreds of thousands. There are a couple out there in hundreds of thousands. A few more in the tens of thousands. A few more in the thousands. A whole lot in the hundreds. And a whole lot in the 50s and so on. In fact, a church of 20 is a far more common expression in the body of Christ than even a church of 200 is. So, if you're in this room today, you probably picked it because you're not probably in the big spike. Your church is probably in the long tail. I've got good news for you. We are serving just as many people in the body of Christ as the people in the big churches are, because there's just so many of us. So look at that and ask yourself, which part of the body of Christ can we do without? Should we in the small churches look at the big churches and go, they're just compromising. Those big churches, they're no good. Or some of our big church friends may be looking at us and going, they're just not living up to their potential. Too bad. And we know both of those attitudes go back and forth. And we got to get rid of those attitudes because the big spike needs the long tail and the long tail needs the big spike. But the challenge has been almost all of our resources come from the big spike and they don't understand what's happening in the long tail. And that's not a push against them. That's just simply what happens when you spend your time in a big context. You forget what it's like in the smaller context. We need to embrace the long tail, including if you're in a church in the long tail, embrace where God has put you. Here's some good news for you. People will come to small churches, woohoo, but they won't give up quality to do so. Oh. Why does the front half of that sentence seem awesome and the last half of that sentence really just not quite so much? Because we've got a wrong idea about what quality looks like. Quality looks different in a small church than in a big church. Big church quality is obvious. It's visible. You drive up, you see this massive parking lot. You park, and some friendly parking lot attendant puts you to your spot, and they ask you, would you like to take the shuttle to the main sanctuary? Right? And then you get there, and the signage is awesome, and the coffee is free, and there are people greeting you, and the band is singing songs from their latest album, and the quality is obvious. You go to a small church, the quality isn't as visible, but in a healthy small church, you're more likely to walk out with a friend. That's a level of quality that matters. It's just not as obvious. Quality is not less in a small church. It just looks different in a small church. Quality is not less in a big church. It just looks different in a big church. And we've got to understand that we're working in this together. So how does some of those differences come about? Let's go to our point number 2. Point number 2 is this. We have to discover how small churches function differently from big churches. We do function differently. So I'm going to give you an illustration. When I was doing the research on this several years ago when I was just beginning to do this ministry, and I would read everything I could get my hands on about the differences between big and smaller churches, if they had a visual in the book, the visual was always stair steps or a ladder. Stair steps or a ladder. So a church of 20, 50, 100,000, that kind of thing. And if you see stair steps or a ladder with small on the bottom and big on the top, what does that tell you about the value? Right? Even if that's not the intention of the author, that visual tells me small, bad, big, good. Right? So I wanted to come up with an illustration that gave us an idea of the differences between big and small, but didn't have any sense of value system attached to it. And here's what I came up with. The Venn diagram answers that question. So on the left, you've got the big church stuff, and on the right, you've got the small church stuff. Okay? There is an overlap. And here's how it works. The bigger your church is, the more you have in common with other big churches. The smaller your church is, the less overlap there is, and the less you have in common with big churches. So the smaller your church is, the less help you're able to get from big church resources. Because it simply doesn't adapt to your context more often than not. As you get bigger, there's more help. When you're smaller, there's less help. Again, that's not against them. They're just in a different circle than ours, okay? And the bottom line is that many big church principles simply don't translate well into a small church context. And then we have to add another set to this, and I'm going to add these circles here. These little circles that I'm adding. So you've got the two big circles, big and small, and the overlap. And then on the right side, within the small church circle, you've got these circles that are different colors, different sizes, and here's the most important thing. Those small circles don't touch each other, and here's why. While the circle on the right designates all of the things that small churches, we as small church leaders have in common, the small circles within that big circle, that's a designation of what is unique and different about your church that makes it different than any other church on the face of the earth. So as small church pastors, we actually have to master 3 sets of principles. 1, we have to understand the overlap, the things that all churches have in common. This is what we're typically going to be taught at seminary, Bible college, and so on. Walk out there, hopefully well-equipped, understanding what all churches have in common. Then we have to understand on the left, or on the right, what all small churches have in common. This is not taught nearly as often as it ought to be taught. This is the passion of me and of my ministry and of what I'll be talking about today and tonight. We're talking about those things on the right, what all small churches have in common. Because there are going to be times when you're going to be thinking, it's just me, and then you talk to other small church pastors and you go, it's not just me, it's us. This is how small churches are. And you can start sharing and encouraging and learning from each other. But then, after you've figured out what everybody has in common, and then after you've figured out what you have in common with all other small churches, there's still going to be a piece left over that's just weird about your place, that doesn't apply anywhere else. And the corollary is this: the smaller your church is, the bigger your weird part is. That's just the way it works out. Okay, that's just the way it works out. So we've got to understand all of those, but don't jump to the, oh, my church is different too quickly. Before I started discovering this and I was talking about it, often small church pastors would go, I hear what you're saying about small churches and so on, but my church is just different. It doesn't follow any of the rules. Nonsense. No. You're following certain rules or you don't get to call yourself church. Like, hopefully you believe in Scripture, that Jesus is the way of salvation. There's a handful of things all churches believe if they want to get to call themselves church. Plus, there's a handful of leadership principles like, I don't know, a balanced budget is helpful. Doesn't matter how big or small the church is, right? There's a handful of leadership principles that apply everywhere, and there's a handful of leadership principles that apply in all small churches. Know them first, and then the leftover is, oh, this is just us. Now, where does this come from? It comes from a sociological phenomenon that I discovered a few years ago. I didn't create it, but I read about it. It's called the law of large numbers. The law of large numbers says the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably they behave. This is how every polling company works. So Gallup takes a survey of Americans and says, Americans feel this way about such and such. And have you ever heard that and gone, nobody talked to me, right? Here's the deal. They don't need to talk to you. They don't need to talk to me. There's 3 rules. If they ask the right questions of the right demographic mix of people, and then thirdly, if they have a minimum sample size, all they have to do is add zeros and they'll be correct within a 2 or 3 point margin of error. But you got to have the right questions and the right sample size. Like, I can't ask this group and walk out and go, oh, Americans feel this way. This is, first of all, too few people. And secondly, it's not a good demographic mix, right? We all have a lot in common. There's a whole bunch of different people out there than us. We have to include all the groups, okay? But the minimum sample size is the key that I'm talking about here. Once you get above minimum sample size, you can just add zeros and keep doing it. Here's an example. If you are pastoring a church of 2,000 and you go to a conference being taught by a pastor of a church of 20,000, virtually everything that pastor of a church of 20,000 says you can do in your church of 2,000, just drop a zero and you're good to go. Why? You're above minimum sample size. So they're talking about, how to organize your parking lot and how to set up different age divisions and how to work with staffing. And almost everything they do, you can do because the Venn diagram is almost exactly a circle. There's a sliver of difference, but not an awful lot. So you think, okay, 20,000 down to 2,000, drop a zero, we're good to go. That means 2,000 down to 200, drop a zero, I'm good to go. No. You're beneath minimum sample size. Everything changes. Right? They're talking about how to do their parking lot attendance, and you're going, oh, they have a parking lot. Right? We're talking about age departments. You're going, wow, they have different classes for different age of kids. We got like 2 kids on a good Sunday. Right? It just simply changes. And then you go 200 down to 50, and it changes again. And then you're going to have 2 churches of 50. They can be of the same denomination, in the same town, on the same street, and you might as well be on 2 different planets. Why? Because they got 50 different people than they got. Now, I understand this church of 2,000 has 2,000 different people than this church of 2,000 has, but once you're above minimum sample size, once you get to a large group, it's really about trends and not about individual personalities. But in 2 churches of 50, it's different. Why? Because in this church of 50 over here, when they lose one family, there goes their entire children's ministries department. They didn't just take the teachers, they took all the kids. But in this church of 50, when that one person who we all love doesn't show up at church one Sunday, we all breathe a little easier because at least this week we won't have that awkward confrontation in the lobby. And don't any of you act like you don't know what I'm talking about, because every one of you has a name and face in mind right now. And here's the deal. I know this is true because the rule is this. Every church has one. And if your church doesn't have one, some other poor church has 2. So keep them in your prayers. So That's the law of large numbers. The larger the group is, the more predictably it behaves. So there are a lot of resources that big churches can share with each other. It's harder in smaller churches because we have more distinctions and more differences, because the smaller the churches, the more the individual personalities affect the whole. Right? So the big church, they have that interesting person too. But that just means the pastor gets a weird email once a week. But that interesting person in a church of 20, church of 50, they can ruin your Sunday. They can split your church. They can push you out of ministry. Individual people have big impact in smaller churches for the good and the bad, which gets us to number 3. We need to understand and use the unique DNA of your small church for God's glory. So how do we start to do that? Well, we've begun talking about the unique DNA. So let's take a look at the law of large numbers again. If the law of large numbers says that the bigger the crowd is, the more predictably it behaves, here's the flip side of the law of large numbers. The smaller the crowd is, the more impact each person has for good and for bad. That's the other side of the coin. So we talked about the bad, that one person who can ruin your Sunday. But let's talk about the good. I want you to imagine that you play a little guitar. And you show up in a church of 10,000 on a Sunday where the band is singing songs from their latest album. You can sit there and you can enjoy it, but you're also going to be thinking, I am never getting on that stage with my guitar, am I? No, you are not. Wouldn't be good for you, wouldn't be good for them, wouldn't be good for the people who have to listen to it. But if you play a little guitar and you walk into a church of 50 on Sunday, you can be leading in worship in a month. In fact, it may not take a month. If they find out you play guitar, their first question will be, is your guitar in the car now? This is, in fact, one of the primary reasons people go to smaller churches. The 2 biggest reasons people give for why they go to small churches, reason number 1, the pastor knows my name. There are people out there who want to be pastored by their pastor, and they're not wrong for wanting so. Other people don't need it. They get their pastoring in small groups. God bless both. Great. The second reason, because I have an impact there. I'm effective there. When I'm gone, they miss me, and when I show up, it matters. So the person who plays a little guitar has a chance to really minister. They can really have an impact there. So let's talk about a couple quick differences between big and small, and then we'll let you go for lunch. One of the biggest things that I've noticed between big and small is this, and this will help to give you a filter so that even the next time you hear from a big church pastor conference or read a big church pastor book or listen to a podcast from a big church pastor, and I listen to read all of that, it'll give you a filter to know what will apply in your context and what might not. Big church leadership emphasizes process, systems, and programs. I noticed this a few years ago, going to conference after conference, and they're always talking about the process and their systems and their programs, and why? And I realized, well, because if you're trying to manage the flow of hundreds or thousands of people on a weekend, if your processes and your systems and programs aren't dead on, you're in trouble. So they have to talk about that. We have to have good processes, good systems, and good programs in small churches as well, but the main difference for us is this. We have to prioritize relationships, culture, and history. We have to emphasize relationships, culture, and history. Let me walk you through those 3 important words. First of all, relationships. Every once in a while, a small church pastor will ask me, what curriculum do you recommend for discipleship in small churches? And my answer is generally, whatever works for you. And how can I be so nonchalant about something so important as discipleship? I'm not nonchalant about discipleship. I'm nonchalant about the curriculum you pick. Here's why. The way we disciple people is not through curriculum, it's through relationships. Jesus didn't use curriculum. Paul didn't use curriculum. They used the oldest method and the best method for discipling people ever devised, a method called mentoring. I'm convinced that in a lot of our churches, big and small, we think we're discipling people, but we're not. We're just getting them done with the classes. If you're having discipleship classes, they're not built around intentional relationship, you are not mentoring, you are not discipling your people, you're just teaching them stuff. Now, teaching is fine. I'm teaching now. I'm not against teaching. But I'm not mentoring you because I don't have a relationship with you. The teaching can be helpful, but it's not discipleship until relationship is at its core. Big church, small church, the same thing. In a big church, the pastor trains others to do the hands-on mentoring in small groups and ministry teams. But in a small church, the pastor is going to do more of the hands-on mentoring, more of the hands-on discipling. But even in a small church, no matter how small it is, we should be actively looking to disciple people who become disciple makers themselves. It shouldn't be all on our shoulders. So, relationships. Secondly, culture. What is culture? The definition of culture in this context is simple. It's the unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. The unwritten set of rules that governs everything a church does. So every once in a while, somebody in your church will go, "That's not the way we do it here." That's a statement of culture. Or people will go, "Oh, it's just the way it is in this church." That's a statement of culture. It could very well be that the strongest culture enforcers in your church have no idea they're enforcing culture. They're just doing it the way church has always been done it. Right? So, excuse me. Culture is a big conversation point in big churches as well, and correctly so. But in a big church, here's how they'll teach it. Pastor, you establish the culture in your church. You drive the culture in your church. You communicate the culture in the church. The culture of your church is up to you. And they are not wrong from their big church circle. That is how it has to be in a big church. You walk into a church of 1,000 or more, do you expect to impact the culture? No. You expect to understand it, accept it, or reject it, and that's it. But in a small church, everybody who walks in and leaves changes the culture. So if you are in a small church, especially if you're in a small town, especially if the church is older, especially if the people in the church are older, especially if you're new to the church, especially if you're a young pastor, the more of those things that apply, if you walk into a small church and say, "I'm going to set the culture of this church and I'm going to tell this church culture where to go," all I can tell you is this: God bless you at your next church. Because that's not how it works in a small church. Here's how it works in a small church. You want to lead the culture? Here's the 3 steps you need to take. First step, you have to know the culture of that church. You have to know the culture of that church. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about the culture of that church. They have to know that you get them and that you appreciate them. And then, thirdly, then they will give you this. Then they will give you limited permission to participate with them in moving the culture forward. And all those words matter. So let me walk you through it again. First of all, you have to know the culture of the church. Secondly, you have to show them what you appreciate about the culture of the church. And only then, thirdly, will they give you limited permission to participate with them in moving the culture forward. The smaller the church is, the more that applies. The younger or newer you are, the more that applies. The smaller the town is, the more that applies. The older the members of the church are, the more that applies. That's how it works in a smaller church. So yes, we are, in a smaller church, it's like it's a participatory thing between the pastor and the congregation, and we've got to work that dance out with them, the culture. And thirdly, history. They say that small towns have long memories, so do small churches. So if you're in a situation where your church, you look at the history of your church and you think this history feels more like an anchor weighing us down, I wish it was a foundation on which to build, it can be. I can go real quick through this story. In our church, way back in the day, I actually found this article a few years ago. I don't know how well you can read it from there. It's from early 1960s, about a year or two after our church was established. The headline says, "The church can work with delinquents." And the first paragraph says this: "As an institutional caseworker and probation officer, I searched for many months for a church really concerned about the needs of juvenile delinquents. Until recently, I could find none." And then he talks about a conversation he had with the founding pastor of our church almost 60 years ago, in which the founding pastor of our church talked about how they want to do new things in a new way and reach a new generation. And as I read that, I realized, you know how we connect with our foundation? We don't do what our founders did. We need to start thinking like our founders thought. We think we honor our founders by singing the songs they sang, sitting in the seats they built, on the carpet that they laid. That's not how we honor our founders. The people who founded your church were pioneers and innovators. How do I know that? Because they started a new church instead of staying in an old one. We honor them by thinking like they thought. One last quick thing here. If you do want to follow me anymore, I've got a podcast called Can This Work in a Small Church? Anywhere you listen to podcasts. I've got my books out there as well that you can find on your way out the door. Get more of that. But here's the last thing. Tonight, 4:30, we're going to talk about influence is the new attendance. If it's not about counting numbers, what does it look like, and how are we influencing our community is the new measurement. But let me leave you with this before you go to lunch. Pastoring a small church is not a penalty for doing something wrong. I thought it was for years. Right, how many of us said, "Oh Lord, what am I doing wrong?" Probably a whole bunch of stuff. The big church pastor's probably doing a whole bunch of stuff wrong too. You being in a small church is not a penalty for the stuff you've done wrong. Pastoring a small church is a specialty, and it's worth doing well. So let's stop whining about what we have or don't have. Here's one last truth. Jesus did not wake up this morning depressed by the size of your church. You may have, but he never has. He knows exactly who you have and don't have. He knows your budget. He knows your building. He knows your training. He knows your passion. He knows your call. He knows all of it better than you do. And he's just fine with it. Let's stop offering excuses. Let's get on the job with Jesus. You can pastor your church right now and be effective at the size it is right now. God bless you as you go and do that. Thank you.